All right, so sitting on my Zoom screen, but 3,000 miles from here, is my good friend Rabbi Lance Sussman, who was both a successful pulpit rabbi, having served for several decades, a couple of decades anyway, at Knesset Israel and outside of Philadelphia, one of the founding Reform synagogues in the United States, who holds a PhD in Jewish history from Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati, and managed an incredible feat as a very busy pulpit rabbi. Namely, he was able to be a pulpit rabbi and a successful scholar at the same time. But we're here to discuss his first of a trilogy of books called Portrait of an American Rabbi, which is a collection of his sermons over the course of his time at KI in Philadelphia. And they're a remarkable collection of his thoughts over this period of time on Shabbat, on the high holidays, and on other occasions. And what I'd like to do is talk with him about some of his focus, some of what it means to give a sermon, maybe some of what it means to be a pulpit rabbi in terms of his own interpretation of what that role is. And we'll just see where the conversation goes. I wanted to start with a kind of an anecdote about that I think, while it's an anecdote and it's not a study, it may typify the state of sermons in American synagogues today. I was at a meeting of the Central Conference of American Rabbis in Boston a few years ago, and we sat down at a table, and I was with colleagues. I don't think I was friendly with any of them. I don't think I knew them. And the topic of sermons came up. And virtually everybody at the table admitted that in some way or other, they don't give sermons anymore. So I want to start by asking Lance about the giving of a sermon, what he understands that he's doing when he gives a sermon, when he writes and gives a sermon, and then maybe a few additional questions in that vein will emerge, and if not, we'll move on to other topics. So that's not a pointed question, but you know what I'd like you to talk about, Lance. So your idea about giving a sermon, maybe where it came from, how you do your sermons, and we'll go on to some other topics.
Great. Well, first, thank you so much for inviting me to have this chat with you. I'm so glad to do it, and really honoring me by allowing me to talk about my work. So, Rabbi, thank you. For me personally, I want to divide this comment between the personal and the historical. For me personally, I grew up at a Reformed synagogue in Baltimore, Maryland, Oheb Shalom. I grew up in a family that was extremely active. We were part of that small percentage in the Reform movement that went to synagogue every week. Friday night was temple night. We had an early Shabbat dinner, and we were off to synagogue. And I would say in my formative period, whatever that means, there were two truly outstanding preacher rabbis in my home synagogue, which is very much like the synagogue that I served here in Philadelphia for the last 2 decades. Rabbi Abraham Shaw and Rabbi Martin Wiener, who was up in the San Francisco area afterwards. They were just outstanding preachers. And the way I experienced services as a young person was first of all the kind of majesty of classical reform, and the second was the rabbi's message, and somehow the message was transmitted to me, or this is how I received it, that the sermon was the capstone, it was the pinnacle of the service experience. And we went every week, and people listened intently. They were beautifully delivered, well-crafted, literate sermons, sometimes dramatic, but not histrionic. And particularly on the high holidays, people waited to hear the sermon. And I remember as soon as the sermon was done, there was some kind of evaluation by sounds. You could hear people talking and breathing and smiling, or looking at each other to process what they had just learned. The sermons were of an intellectual, entertaining, but of an intellectual nature. And that gave me a model that I carried forward. I never had a break from synagogue in my life, because I went from, my parents' home to college. And during my college years, I continued going to synagogue, the local Reform synagogue. I went to Franklin and Marshall, and Shari Shemayim in Lancaster was very inviting. I taught Sunday school. So I never really had a break from going to services. And I always looked forward to the sermon. And I had such wonderful models. So that was the personal. My family reinforced that, because they talked about the sermons later. Did they agree? Did they disagree? How was the delivery? I mean, I kind of grew up in a homiletics workshop to some extent. Then second, from a historical point of view, my thesis for rabbinic school, my master's thesis was on the sermons of Isaac Leeser, who was here in Philadelphia prior to the Civil War, and he is the rabbi, the officiant, who introduced preaching to the American Jewish pulpit. And then for my PhD, I wrote a full biography of Leeser, moving beyond his sermons. So a great deal of my academic training actually had to do with reading and analyzing sermons, and how they developed in America in modern times. So the two converged in my own career, and I continued to make the assumptions that I had as a child, and I learned from the lessons in Leeser's age, where the women of his congregation, it was Mikveh Israel, which was Sephardic Orthodox synagogue in Philadelphia. In 1830, none other than Rebecca Gratz came up to him and said, Jewish women don't receive any kind of Jewish education. Why don't you start preaching the way the ministers here in Philadelphia preach, and teach us? So it came from the congregation. It specifically came from women, and he developed preaching, and then other rabbis started preaching, and in time it found its place. Now we're at a different moment in the history of the sermon in the synagogue, and I understand for very different reasons. There's also a diminishing of the role of the sermon in the Orthodox synagogue. But from my point of view, the sermon is primarily a teaching moment. It can have other purposes. It can be celebratory, it can be pastoral, but it's mostly a teaching moment. And what I mostly did was to combine what I had learned, my skills as a historian of the Jewish experience, with the needs of my synagogue, to either learn the background to a current issue or to explore a current issue in an analytical fashion. And it worked for me. I was ordained in 1980, and I retired in 2022. So for 42 years, I was giving sermons, and I never diminished in terms. I never followed the trends, even to shorten them, to tell the truth. I did add more and more entertainment aspects to it as a way of holding on to the congregation. Most of my speaking actually was extemporaneous, and there would be a multi-step process: writing out a message for the weekly online bulletin, delivering without notes, and then, depending on the topic, the moment, the level of priority, then turning it into a fuller written text. And over the course of 21, 22 years, it became a pretty thick file.
Yeah, so I want to push that a little bit. I want to talk about, I want to push that a little bit, because your sermons I give sermons. These days, I'm not going to talk about myself too much, but these days, I rarely write out what I want to talk about. I'll make some notes, and I've developed the skill over the years to be able to speak, as you say, extemporaneously with some notes and give a message. But when I do write out my sermons, and here's where I'm going with this, I have a kind of a word limit in my mind for when I'm going to give a sermon on Shabbat as compared to the high holy days. But looking at your sermons, they are fairly long. They're longer than I would dare to write. Your sermons are filled with all kinds of interesting information, and they're well written and all of that, and there's no doubt
Yeah.
about it. But I wondered as to that experience you had growing up, where your parents debated the sermons, and you look forward to that moment. If you feel as the rabbi at KI that your congregants at that time, up until modern period, you just retired a couple years ago, really could let me put it this way, could handle a 3,000 word sermon.
Well, they needed to get used to it. I would say the book is disproportionately high holiday sermons, in which the local custom in Hagamakon was for a longer text with actually an expectation, but just for the high holidays, that the whole set of sermons be distributed in writing to the congregation.
I wondered if
And I did push the clock, so to speak, and which meant making adjustments with what prayers would be read and how much music in order that there would be sufficient time to preach. I will say that I know many rabbis experience something that must be somewhat painful, that just before the Rosh Hashanah morning sermon, at the very end of the service, or Yom Kippur, there's a small exodus of people who cut out. I understand part of that is just human nature and needing to go to the bathroom and all of that. But I had nobody escape, so to speak. And they waited for the sermon. And over time, I was able to recreate what I had at my synagogue. The deeper reflection on it at this point is this, that Reform synagogues, conservative synagogues, maybe Orthodox, I don't know the sociology as well, are filled with highly educated people. The proportion of congregants who have terminal degrees, MDs, JDs, PhDs, EDDs, is very, very high. It's a very highly educated group of people. Now, it doesn't mean that they're highly educated in Judaism or have Hebrew skills. They don't, but they're there and they have an interest. And it's my strong belief that they come to synagogue for the same reason that Rebecca Gratz went to Isaac Leeser in 1830 and said, "Teach us. You have us right now, and we want to hear what you have to say." Now, in the original example with Rebecca Gratz, what I learned by investigating it was, for the most part, the men actually left because he gave his sermons after Adon Olam, after the service was over, Shabbat morning, and the men would leave and the women would stay up in the balcony to learn. And that's not that unusual. We know from the Puritans in Massachusetts in the 17th century that the church pews were mostly filled with women. I think I had pretty good gender balance, but my assumption is you have a highly educated group that comes motivated to learn about Judaism, and the Reform movement. I wouldn't call it anti-intellectual at this point, but it is trending anti-intellectual. Luckily, there is a vigorous adult education program in general in the Reform movement. Very, very strong at KI, very strong in Philadelphia, very strong in the pocket in Philadelphia where both of us have lived. So there really was a context there, a sociological context, in order to give a more intellectual, more academic, more analytical message. It needed to be balanced. Obviously, you're not going to do that at family services or Touch Shabbat, but people expected some serious message. They came to expect it, and I even got requests. Can you explain what's going on in the Middle East right now? Can you talk about the origins of Reform Judaism? And after a while, it became quite organic, actually, where one of the I always said the only hard part about a sermon is having a good topic. Because once there's a topic, then the mind goes to work, and I have a way. I had excellent instruction at the Hebrew College in terms of learning how to structure a sermon from a literary point of view, and a very good program in delivery. We had a wonderful professor for that. So, once I had the topic, I could easily go to work on it. And sometimes it required a little research, but it's okay, because that's how you learn.
Yeah, so I want to shift kind of somewhat analytically. You write several times about Israel, and maybe we can talk a little bit about Israel, but then I also want to talk about a different element about the nature of sermons. So, in reading your sermons about Israel, you talk about Israel, Hamas, Hezbollah, the American Israel relationship, things that seem kind of, not really, but they seem kind of eternal. These issues have been with us for decades and decades and decades, ever since the state of Israel was founded. And yet, of course, those sermons, as well as every other sermon you give on a specific urgent topic of the moment, are specific urgent topics of the moment, and then they inevitably shift. I mean, the topics may not, the nature of the topic itself may not shift. The topic itself may not shift, but its unfolding continues and change. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit, not so much about Israel. As we're recording this, of course, we're awaiting some nasty response from Iran, and we're still in this unresolved war, and we don't know what Israel is going to look like in a month, much less in 2 years or 5 years from now. But then the nature of the sermon as a reflection on the moment, with the understanding, I guess, perhaps, that things are going to evolve in terms of whatever it is you're speaking about. I hope that's a clear enough question. So I'd like you to talk about that a little bit. And that's sort of analytic about the nature of sermons in general, and maybe some specific things in particular.
Let me answer the Israel part first. I was serving at KI in Philadelphia, Knesset, Israel. Philadelphia has this custom of calling synagogues by their letters. I don't know where that came from. Rhoda Shalom is RS, and KI is Knesset Israel's KI. That's a very Philly thing. The other interesting thing about Philly is unlike the rest of the Reform movement, you don't say you're going to Temple, because in Philadelphia it says you're going to Temple. It means either you're a student at Temple University or going to an Owl basketball game or something like that. So you go to synagogue in Philadelphia, not to Temple, in a Reform context. With respect to Israel, Knesset Israel, particularly after 1942, after the Biltmore Conference, when the American Jewish Community committed itself formally, as best as an amorphous community can commit itself, to the creation of a Jewish state in what was British Palestine. KI became a leader in the American Council for Judaism, and which was anti-Zionist, and it was against the idea of a Jewish political state. Both the rabbi and some of the leading congregants were very, very active in the American Council, and it was a strong anti-Zionist pulpit, and it really took years to get past that. We were one of the few pulpits in this area not to have an Israeli flag in the year 2001 when I arrived, and so I explored it, and eventually we did put up a flag. I had to research the whole history of flags and churches and synagogues, and had some pretty fine, unexpected results from that. So I had some catch-up work to do in terms of just educating the synagogue about Israel. They were eager to learn about it. Israel, Holocaust, Judaism, personal experiences, these are all the building blocks of American Jewish identity. And for better or worse, Israel tends to have something urgent going on almost all the time. In fact, I get nervous when there's nothing urgent because it means something is going to happen. In the years I've experienced Israel, if it gets too quiet, I'm a traditional Jew in that sense. That makes me worry. It's too good. Something's going to happen, and so I speak to Israel in part to fill in the gaps that for years and years they didn't hear about Israel. And the rabbis were slow. My immediate predecessor mostly focused on Reform Judaism in Israel. I think a little less on the bigger picture of the Middle East. And I had these what I viewed as teaching opportunities because of the headlines. One project, though, along the way is the fact that Bibi Netanyahu grew up in the community where I lived and had a pulpit, and many of my congregants who were basically my age, a tad older, knew him as a student in the local Cheltenham schools. So there was an added interest in Israel because they felt a connection, for better or for worse, negative, positive, with Netanyahu. I even went around interviewing people who knew him and put together a profile that I gave as a sermon on Netanyahu, the Cheltenham years. I don't claim to be a biographer, but just that little piece, because it's enough to draw if I to give a sermon on a really hot topic, and you can begin by saying, remember when you were on the school bus with Netanyahu? Do you remember when he kept carrying that soccer ball, even though the bus driver kept telling him no sports equipment? I would have some little hook there to localize it and personalize it that I could then go into a bigger topic. And generally, my views on Israel were not viewed as controversial. I would try to be careful and not bombastic in what I had to say about it, to be positive and supportive as much as possible, and critical when necessary, using the prophetic model. And so they turned to me. I also had regular congregational trips to Israel. I would say 5 or 6 trips over 20 years, plus a number of personal trips or other missions in which I was constantly reporting on Israel. I would say the members of my synagogue used their synagogue as kind of a one-stop shop for everything Jewish. So they relied on me, and they relied on the synagogue to get their Israel information, and that strengthened the moment for me to give a fuller talk on a given Friday night or on the holidays. I usually spoke about Israel on Rosh Hashanah morning. I found a way to tie it to the Akedah, to the story of the binding of Isaac, and proceed from there to talk about whatever the moment demanded.
So before you go on to the other element of my question, sticking with Israel for a moment, and sticking with your discussion of sermons as teaching tools, do you think that over the years, the 2 decades or so that you were at KI, you were able to shift the, I don't know, commitment, knowledge about Israel in a significant way beyond where the synagogue had been before you got there?
I hope so. I'd like to think so. I mean, there was a fairly large synagogue that I inherited, and it had a broad spectrum of people who knew about Israel on their own. But I think in general, I did raise the level of knowledge. I certainly shifted the curriculum in the religious school. We came to the conclusion, particularly for the older kids, that they were going to be going off to college, and this unfortunately was verified in recent months. And they were going to be in a very different non-cocoon environment in which they may find themselves as Shomer Israel, as defenders of Israel, and that they needed the equipment. So I made a significant part of the confirmation experience, learning about Arab-Israeli conflict, learning about Zionism. When I tested the waters, there wasn't a single kid who could define the term Zionism, who really even had a sense of what Zionism was all about. And I looked to overcome that, and I think it was successful. I feel, we had plenty of kids going on nifty trips and Camp Harlem trips and things like that, and building a positive relationship with Israel, never encouraging lockstep with government policy, but having that basic tie, having that connection, and understanding the historical significance of Israel was really part of my mission as a rabbi.
Yeah, so the broader topic of writing a sermon as capturing a moment. But before you respond to that, I really need to say something I wish I'd said a bit earlier, which is that your sermons really reflect the fact that you have the writer's touch and the historian's mind, so that even if what you're saying about something that you're describing of the moment, it always includes historical reflections, and your sermons are comfortably chock-a-block with the historical elements of whatever it is you're talking about. And I have to say, you do that quite well. But
Thank
but
you.
still, but
Thank you very
still,
much.
but still
Right.
the moment passes. And I'm wondering if you have any reflections on that element of what it means to give a sermon.
Okay, let me add another autobiographical piece to explain the context. Another thing that I did was to shift some of the adult education itself to Friday night. Um, worked with people, worked with a congregant to develop PowerPoints to teach the Jewish experience, and at a certain point decided with a certain frequency, let's say once every 3 months, that I would not give a sermon at all. But after Kaddish, I would then go into a full PowerPoint presentation that could be anywhere from 60 to 90 minutes, followed by the Onyx Shabbat afterwards, so that people were coming several times a year on Friday night, and actually would be sitting into the equivalent of a full Tuesday, Thursday class in an undergraduate setting. So that made my 30-minute sermon seem that much smaller. Oh, he's only going to talk for 30 minutes tonight. He's not going to speak for 90 minutes. And those evenings had big numbers. They had big numbers. Hundreds and hundreds of people would come to these talks, which were mostly historical in nature, and that was part of the context where I could go long, so to speak. I hope I went long and deep. I didn't go long just to go long. I will say that in terms of creating sermons, because I also had an academic career, and I learned quickly to teach on Tuesdays and Thursdays and have 90-minute class, two 90-minute classes instead of 3 50-minute classes. I learned how to talk pretty freely, without notes and in a structured fashion and all of that. So, and I continued to teach, and I can still teach now. I'm retired from the pulpit. I'm not retired from my academic work. So it kind of kept me primed, and and my head was in a place where, for a lot of rabbis, an intellectual, analytical, academic analysis of the situation in Israel may be an unusual experience for them. For me, it was actually part of my flow because I was teaching at the same time during the week, whether, before COVID, it was in person, and then later it was everything was online. Now it's kind of mixed, but I was talking in an intellectual academic fashion just about all the time. And I would say there are rabbis who are mostly counselors. There are rabbis who are social activists. There are rabbis who are administrators, and there are rabbis who are teachers. And I put myself in the category as rabbi, teacher, preacher, and that became the main characteristic of my rabbinate. And it must have worked. They didn't get rid of me. I never had a problem with a renewal. There was some controversy. There was controversy every once in a while if it was something hot came up, and I took a stand. I also came mid-career, which would make sense to Knesset Israel, so that I learned um, about. I learned that if I would, did I really want to actually trigger a controversy? Whereas when I was a younger rabbi, I would be caught up in the headlines, and I would be very passionate about the moment. I had enough experience, 20 years experience before I got here, that I could be a little more deliberate um, before pulling a trigger, knowing full well what would come afterwards. And the fact that I did structure my talks in a more academic way actually helped it, with one exception, contain those controversies. The other night, I did a Zoom podcast, a national podcast on the sense of isolation that American Jewish liberals are feeling right now, and I was warned that there could be some people from the political right who were going to be unhappy with me, and I got no objection. And I called the people afterwards. I called the sponsors and said, "How come they didn't pounce on me?" And they said, "Well, they felt you were balanced enough in how you contextualized it that there was no need to challenge." So I think I learned something about how to play that situation from the pulpit. Again, with the most important thing was having the teaching moment and being very selective about the prophetic model, where it was up to me, some sense of responsibility to actually take a stand.
All right, so I think I'm going to ask one more question, which comes from at least one of your sermons, but is not at the moment in which you wrote the sermon, but of this moment. And that's I'm tempted to ask a broad question about American Judaism, but I'll restrict the question to American Reform Judaism. You mentioned earlier that you see a large anti-intellectual component in the movement, and I tend to agree. And I've had experiences just recently that among colleagues that verifies that. But more broadly, the Reform movement has experienced a decline in population. One branch of its seminary is going to close in a couple of years, the Cincinnati branch of Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, which sadly and maybe ironically was the first campus of this now 4-campus entity, soon to be, well, it's not going to close entirely, so it will remain a 4-campus entity. But as a movement, where are we and where ought we to be headed? That's an ethical question, and you're a historian, not an ethicist, but nonetheless, I imagine you have something of that nature to point out to us.
Right. Well, first, the reform movement was born of the politics of emancipation and cultural shifts, and Jews being absorbed into the mainstream of society, which included the reduction of the content of Judaism. It was no longer a yeshiva davening community. But at the same moment, Reform used academic tools to define itself, particularly from Germany, what was called the Wissenschaft movement, and the very prominent role of history in, as opposed to Talmudic study, in defining what Judaism was and what Judaism should be. So Reform actually was born of that kind of intellectualism. It was, from a statistical point of view, a very small movement. It was controversial. There was a lot of fireworks, but I think as late as World War II, there were only about 50,000 members of Reform synagogues in the United States, and the numbers increased vastly after World War II as a function of suburbanization. Yeah.
And do you think, I was going to just ask, what accounts for that? You say suburbanization, but what about suburbanization inspired the increase of the population of Reform Jews?
I think after World War II and many of the soldiers hearing chaplains in the military had a different sense of Judaism after the war. And when they moved out to the burbs, the ethnic enclaves in the city were replaced with suburban homes that were not as dense, were not as ethnic. It was another generation removed from immigration. And the synagogue became, it was the replacement for the old Jewish neighborhood. The old Jewish neighborhood then went into the inside of the walls of the synagogue. The most of the people who joined Reform at that point were of East European origin and had a different sense of tradition than the Reform Jews before World War II, who were mostly of German origin. And they brought very different cultural luggage with them. So the movement grew tremendously after World War II. I think one of the mechanisms, actually, and this is not well researched, is they discovered the relationship between bar mitzvah, there was no bar mitzvah yet, between bar mitzvah and temple membership. And once they linked those two, the synagogues really started to grow. The research on that is still pretty thin. I actually only found one paper explicitly from a conference from a Canadian scholar, but all types of reasons drove the expansion of the Reform movement. And then it had another big surge in membership at the end of the 20th century because of mixed marriage. Many Jews who grew up in the conservative movement now found themselves uncomfortable in conservative synagogues and migrated to Reform. So this migration to Reform actually grew the movement at the end of the 20th century. Everything now is in the non-Orthodox world, everything is trending downward in terms of the main denominations.
What initially brought formerly conservative Jews into Reform synagogues? What are some of the factors?
Conservative Judaism was a construct. It actually was part of the Reform movement originally, and it was a protest against the diminished use of Hebrew and ultimately halakha as a methodology of change. Reform shifted away from halakha as a methodology of change. I think it was generational. They were that much further away from the immigrant experience. The function of these big movements in American Judaism initially was to teach people who were Jewish how to be American. And that mission was accomplished by the third and fourth generations. And now they had to teach Americans how to be Jewish. And Reform was a comfortable place for people whose Jewish content had become very, very small. And Reform was comfortable because it wouldn't assume you knew a tremendous amount. And then the question was, to what extent would the synagogues, and particularly the rabbis and educators, use the opportunity to teach and infuse? So Judaization becomes the new mission. I can't give you a specific year, but it's after World War II, of the purpose of reform. I thought, in general, reform was doing a good job until the shift came toward personal spirituality. And then the emphasis went more away from Judaization to spiritualization, which didn't always involve rooting it in Jewish sources. That's actually finding its way back into it. So it's not all just Buddhism or Quakerism, but it's actually coming out of the sources of Judaism. And most of the really creative activity in that area today is taking outside of the movements and what they call disruptive experiments in Jewish life. Many of them are kind of urban, and they are trying to figure out what the rising generation looks like. It looks these new cultural models are beginning to emerge among the 20s and 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, and we'll see what happens, because the old model of the big suburban synagogue with the grassy lawn and the Hebrew school and dues-based membership clearly is not working anymore.
Well, I guess that's true in a certain way. But wherever I travel in my life as an interim rabbi, I still hear about the big synagogues. I hear Wilshire Boulevard Synagogue competes with Stephen S. Wise, and generationally one's more successful than the other, but they're both still functioning significantly as that kind of synagogue that you're referring to. On the other hand, there's
So long as they have strong endowments, they're okay.
yeah,
If they live on the revenue of the moment, if they live on dues, it's a much tougher. But the big powerhouses tend to have deep pockets, which can sustain all types of programming, multiple layers of programming, all at the same time, because they're endowed. So they will survive. They will survive the moment. Whether the smaller and medium places can survive the moment's a different story.
Well, okay. I think we'll call it here. I've learned a great deal from you, and as always, enjoyed talking with you. This is a Dr. Rabbi Lance Sussman, and it's a big, thick book. As he pointed out to me before we began,
I don't know if it'll show. There we go.
he would refer me to his personal psychiatrist if I had read the book from cover to cover. It's about 10,000 pages. No, it's a significantly long book. But the sermons, I will say, because they're not they're not scholarship. They are scholarly. They read very easily, and it's worth picking up if you're interested in reading what a pretty intelligent rabbi has had to say, as I mentioned earlier, interesting topics of the moment. So Lance, thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil.
Yeah.